There's possibility there may be another offshoot movie somewhere about an offshoot character in that world.
But not
But not
episode 7.
about Luke Skywalker, not about that group of people and that struggle to bring democracy back to the galaxy.
Star Wars Episode 7 was a bad idea at its inception, because quite simply the original trilogy had already wrapped everything up perfectly. Peace, liberty, and democracy in the galaxy had been restored, the bad guy had been defeated, and the fallen Jedi had found his redemption. The prequels then went back and told the origin of these key elements, establishing that this is what the saga was about. How can you wrap up a 6-part saga and then just make Episode 7? How can you make it work as a continuation of what had been before? There are 4 options for how to structure the sequel trilogy in relation to the original saga, which I will now list in order from worst to best, concluding with the option I've arrived at for this video. The first and worst option would be to simply repeat the original trilogy, have the galaxy start off in a dark place, and make episodes 7 to 9 about getting the galaxy to a good place. This is the worst idea since it completely undoes the significance of the original trilogy. Episodes 4 to 6 might as well have not happened if the galaxy is going to be just as bleak and hopeless in episode 7 as it was in episode 4. You may notice that this was the option settled upon by the good people at Disney. I suppose I should take this moment to say that I hate episode 7. I think this is quite a rare opinion, with a lot of people finding episode 7 basically just alright but not great.
I'm not in love with it. I didn't hate it. It's a competent movie.
For me, it's a film I genuinely loathe from the greatest depths of my being, because it destroys the original trilogy. Everything that comes after episode 7 is now occurring in a universe where the original fight of Han, Luke, and Leia has been rendered completely irrelevant to the overall saga. The only way that I can enjoy the original trilogy is to just pretend that episode 7 doesn't exist, to pretend that the rebellion's victory in Return of the Jedi is final. When you have to pretend that one film in a saga doesn't even exist in order to enjoy a substantial proportion of the rest of the saga, I don't think you can just say, it was a bit disappointing. Now, the second option would be to have a story that shows the gradual decline of the galaxy. Basically, if the first option was repeating the original trilogy, this would be repeating the prequel trilogy. We start off with the galaxy doing pretty well, and end with the galaxy in a dark place. This unconventional structure would at least mean that episode 6 had some point, setting up the positive situation in episode 7. However, the overall saga would have a depressing conclusion. I don't think we want episode 9 to end like episode 3. The third option would be to stuff the decline and resurgence of the galaxy into one final trilogy, thus repeating and condensing the entire saga so far. This would allow for the achievements of episode 6 to be acknowledged, while also ending on a positive note. However, it would be a lot of plot for a single trilogy to take on, and would probably feel very rushed. You may notice that these 3 options all involve repeating the structure of the original film so far, repeating the original trilogy, repeating the prequel trilogy, or repeating the entire saga. However, the fourth option, and I would argue the only option that works, is what I'm going to call the drawn-out victory option. Basically, show the positive effects of the rebel victory in episode 6, however also show the challenges to this victory being fully realized, while ending with the victory being finally solidified in episode 9. The victory in episode 6 is the catalyst for the sequel trilogy and the ultimate victory, rather than something that's just going to be awkwardly glossed over. However, the only way to make episode 7 work is to employ the logic that you can't achieve victory by blowing up a space station and throwing the bad guy down a reactor core shaft. Now, this still isn't a perfect option. It still undeniably robs episode 6 of its climactic quality, but it's the best option out of a long list of bad options. This is why I say the entire idea of episode 7 was a bad one to begin with. Spoiler alert, there are several issues like this when working out how to make the sequel trilogy good, which I'll try to address as they emerge. I think it's worth jumping into the opening shot of the film, because the opening shot of the Disney version is really, really bad. It pretty much ruins the entire trilogy right from the beginning. We look up as a huge First Order ship blocks out the light and takes up the entire shot. This shot communicates 3 things. The ship taking up the entire shot shows the power of the First Order, that we're looking up at the ship shows the supremacy of the First Order, and the way the ship blocks out the light shows that the First Order has extinguished light from the galaxy. This isn't film school over analysis, This is simply recognizing what the shot is communicating at a basic level, and indeed these inferences are confirmed by how the First Order are presented throughout the rest of the film. The First Order really isn't shown as being meaningfully less powerful than the Empire. It's also worth noting that the opening shot to Episode 4 shows an Imperial ship fighting with a Rebel ship. The possibility that the Empire could be defeated is conveyed here by showing the rebels taking a stand. By contrast, the opening shot to this film presents the First Order as totally dominant and unopposed. I can't think of any opening shot that would be a greater insult to the original trilogy than this. This one shot totally undoes the victory of the original trilogy. But the good news is that this shot is quite easy to fix. Instead of a First Order ship, have it be a New Republic ship. This communicates that the New Republic is powerful, which immediately validates the victory of the rebellion. Of course, it shouldn't blot out the light like the First Order ship does, so there needs to be some kind of light source off to the side. I'm not going to go into this much detail with shot composition for the rest of the rewrite, but I feel like at this point it's worth stressing, because Disney's version screws up such a basic thing that it really just needs to be stressed. Just based on changing this shot, I hope it's clear that this rewrite is going to be a very different movie. Not one that totally undermines the victory of the rebellion, but instead one that features characters trying to build on the successes of the original trilogy. Piloting the ship, we find one of our main heroes, Poe Dameron. We see that he is looking down at Jakku, where some surveillance technology on the ship is picking up a large military convoy moving through the desert. Poe expresses concern that this could be warlord activity and resolves to head down with a scouting party to check it out. The camera pans to a small group of soldiers behind him, gearing up to head down. We then cut to Rey scavenging a giant Star Destroyer, much like in the Disney movie. The only difference here would be that she actually sees Poe's convoy flying overhead before she heads off on her way into the desert. Poe lands and notices that the convoy is surprisingly well supplied, so he assesses the situation and directs his soldiers to surround the militia. However, instead his men end up being picked off by the militia one by one, and Poe is captured. He's identified as a captain, and a member of the militia says that they should wait until Kylo Ren returns before killing him. Poe irreverently asks who Kylo Ren is. Kylo Ren approaches an industrial complex on Jakku. Large numbers of scruffy slaves busily work on renovating old pieces of junk into weapons and transports. Kylo is negotiating the sale of weapons and ships with Unkar Plutt when Rey arrives back from the desert and begins engaging in mechanical work with the salvaged scraps. However, as she's fixing up a ship, a wrench slowly starts to wobble on a surface above where she's working. It falls towards her, but before it can hit Rey in the head, she instinctively reaches out and grabs it. Suddenly, we see Kylo glance around, having clearly noticed something is up. So let's talk about the First Order. You may have noticed that Kylo is negotiating with some junk dealer who makes weapons from scraps with the help of slave labor. This isn't the Empire. It's clear that the rebels in the original trilogy achieved something. This remnant of the Empire is markedly less powerful and struggling to achieve some sort of resurgence by starting from the ground up. I didn't pitch the opening crawl, but if I did, it would be something like this. The Empire has been defeated. The forces of the New Republic work to bring about peace across the galaxy and restore order. However, much of the galaxy controlled by the Empire has remained fractured and plagued with war and crime. At a time of crisis, Luke Skywalker has disappeared, and the Jedi have again become a legend throughout the galaxy. Agents of the New Republic operate throughout the galaxy, attempting to defend and expand the victories of the rebellion. This pretty much tells you everything you need to know, and I for my part think it sets up a much more promising story that won't be such an insult to the original trilogy. Anyway, so Poe has been captured by the First Order and is being kept at their base in the desert, and at this point we get a broader impression of the First Order and see that they are pretty rough around the edges. Poe starts objecting quite loudly to being held captive and ends up attracting the attention of a First Order soldier, Finn. Yes, Finn, not FN something something. This First Order wouldn't have the ability to literally reprogram soldiers into mindless killing machines. These are people. Finn's characterization in The Force Awakens is absolutely terrible, and the implications of this extend into the rest of the trilogy. Admittedly, there's a pretty big challenge in showing somebody changing sides in the Star Wars universe when one side is portrayed as so unambiguously evil and the other side is portrayed as so unambiguously good. I think Episode 3 had a pretty big challenge showing how Anakin could go from being basically a good guy to murdering the entirety of the Jedi, but at least the film tried. Similarly, going from being literally programmed from birth to be a mindless soldier and then suddenly being a good guy with a personality and meaningful relationships is also a pretty big jump. And the film doesn't even try to put this down to characterization at all. Rather, Finn is simply presented as having had defective programming. This takes something that could have been interesting about his character and reduces it to nothing of interest. There's no attempt to actually show him changing. He gets involved in one fight, immediately realizes he doesn't want to be on the First Order's side, and then defects. This also thematically kind of sucks. It could have been an opportunity to humanize the opposition and maybe add some subtlety to the film. I mean, obviously when you're watching a war film, you're quite likely to just be cheering whoever are the good guys, even when they're killing soldiers. However, at least most war films don't just unambiguously say that anybody who didn't defect after their first battle is simply a mindless automaton, solely inclined towards merciless killing. I'm not saying that this film needed to go out of its way to present stormtroopers as sympathetic, but it didn't have to so soundly reject that idea. So, for several reasons, the limitations a successor movement to the Empire would face after the original trilogy, the ruining of Finn's character arc, and the destruction of any moral nuance, I've decided that in my version of The Force Awakens, those who fight for the First Order will just be regular people. So why do they fight for the First Order? Well, that's what Finn explains in conversation with Poe. Basically, the New Republic is not currently able to bring order to the galaxy. Part of this is that the Republic is not being harsh enough with criminals. Bandits and pirates and kidnappers still roam the galaxy, murdering and robbing and capturing whole communities. The Republic insists on giving every single one of these people fair trials, which limits how much the Republic can actually do to stop criminals. A lot of resources are tied up in all this due process. The First Order, conversely, is bringing order back to the galaxy much more ruthlessly. As soon as they find anybody suspected of breaking the law, they kill them. Poe obviously interjects a bit here and says that, maybe liberal democracy and fair trials and human rights are a good thing. But Finn's like, hey, you have been patrolling Jakku for years and things haven't got better. We have been executing bandits for a few weeks and things are already getting better. Then Poe's like, but how do you know that you're even killing the right people? You're murdering innocents and claiming it's justice. And then Finn is like, hey, my family were taken as slaves when I was a kid. They're out there somewhere suffering, if they're still alive. Innocent people are suffering every day to make the bad guys richer and more powerful. Innocent people are always going to suffer. At least we're making the bad guys afraid. That's justice. So now Poe starts getting kind of angry and says that this group of vigilante warlords isn't going to bring order to the galaxy. He points to a particularly out of shape and dim-witted looking First Order soldier to illustrate his point that these guys aren't up to the task. This provokes the anger of the First Order soldier who threatens to kill Poe. Finn explains they shouldn't kill him because he's a captain and they need to wait for Kylo to get back. But the soldier is clearly going to shoot him, which results in Finn wrestling with the soldier to get the gun from him. The gun discharges several times and ends up blowing the lock off the cage Poe is in, but also hits some electronics and starts a fire. Finn gets knocked out and all the soldiers end up running off. Poe is about to run off too, but decides to rescue the unconscious Finn before stealing a speeder and escaping. Meanwhile, Kylo is having a call with Snoke in a private part of the junkyard, where he tells Snoke about the Force sensitivity he felt. Snoke bristles at this and instructs Kylo to wipe out everybody in the junkyard to kill the Force-sensitive person. Kylo pushes back at this both with moral and logistical objections, but Snoke insists. He says that Luke Skywalker has been driven underground, but a re-emergent movement of Force users could threaten everything they've built. Kylo ultimately agrees to the demands of his superior. Rey continues to work in the junkyard when she suddenly sees an exhausted and injured Poe scrambling over the walls of the compound. She runs up to him to try and work out who exactly he is and what's going on. He acknowledges that revealing this information might get him killed, but identifies himself accurately as a captain with the New Republic. He then quickly explains that he's going to die if he doesn't escape soon. Rey has a lot of uncertainty about helping Poe since she's a slave. It's not like she's had good experiences with doing rebellious stuff in the past, but she agrees because she's a good person and can tell Poe needs her help. So she decides that there is one ship she's quite familiar with and would probably be able to help Poe fly since she's been working on fixing it up. We get the big reveal, it's the Millennium Falcon. They get into the Millennium Falcon and just as they're taking off, Unkar Plutt sees them escaping and is incensed with rage. He sees Kylo Ren appear and before he can even begin to voice his anger at the situation, Kylo Ren cuts him down. Having just escaped, Poe casually mentions flying all the way to the inner core and whether they have enough fuel. However, Rey is just like, no, I can't do that. I need to go back to Jakku. And Poe's like, wait, what? You want to go back to Jakku? Are you crazy? The entire population of Jakku wants to leave Jakku, and I'm offering to take you to the inner core, and you want to go back to Jakku? And then maybe if Poe's dialogue remotely resembles my rough approximation of it here, then Rey could be like, stop saying Jakku. But ultimately, the main point Rey would communicate is that her parents left her on Jakku, and they're coming back. She wants to be there when they return. She explains that she just remembers being a young child, seeing them leave. She doesn't know why, but she knows they're coming back. She just has this feeling that she can't explain, which tells her they're coming back someday, and if she's not there, she'll never see them again. Poe reluctantly agrees to return her to Jakku and says there's a village reasonably close to where she previously was, and significantly, he knows that there's a landlady of a local inn there who is sympathetic to the New Republic. The First Order soldiers show up at the junkyard, and we see that they're on foot, just in case anybody was going to ask why Poe got there before them. Finn enters the junkyard and is visibly distressed. We see him notice that some of the dead at the junkyard have shackles on them, indicating that they were slaves. He starts voicing his objection to one of Kylo's bodyguards within Kylo's earshot, and eventually he's like, hey, I want to talk to Kylo directly. This communicates that Finn is strong-willed and strongly resistant to any sort of hierarchical structure where he's just expected to be cut off from the decisions of the command structure in the First Order. Finn shouts, I want to know why we've been using slaves. I want to know why you killed them. Kylo then responds to Finn directly. He explains that they use slaves because their enemies use slaves. If they paid everybody a fair wage, they would lose any competitive edge they have. They kill without mercy because their enemies kill without mercy. And they use slaves because their enemies use slaves. If they deny themselves obvious advantages based on their own moral principles, then they're denying slaves the world over the liberation that will come with their ultimate victory. This noticeably placates Finn, but he still asks, and why kill them? At this, Kylo sounds sterner, and says that one of the slaves was a dangerous asset the enemy could have used against him. The Supreme Leader told Kylo to carry out this action, and Kylo complied. He approaches Finn in a threatening way and says that the Supreme Leader serves righteousness. He serves the Supreme Leader, and asks Finn who he serves. Finn pauses and collects himself and says, I serve righteousness, I serve the oppressed and the vulnerable of the whole galaxy. I serve the First Order, I serve the Supreme Leader, and I serve you. Kylo nods and opens a box of weapons before saying, we serve the oppressed and we serve the vulnerable. He takes a gun from the box and hands it to Finn. We will serve them well. There is much work to do. Meanwhile, Rey lands and bids farewell to Poe. She approaches a bar and meets Maz Kanata, who takes her inside and begins talking with her. Rey's like, hey, I heard you with the Republic, and Maz laughs and is like, oh, the Republic. They have good ideals, but they can't understand a planet like this where people are killed for being from the wrong village. Rey appears saddened as they sit down, and Maz Kanata explains that it wasn't always like this. It used to be that from every planet there was a hero, a Jedi. From all over the galaxy they emerged, and they kept peace for the Republic. Unfortunately, after the Republic fell, the Jedi were destroyed, and there have not been many since. The ways of the Force have been lost. But, Maz adds, there has been an awakening, and if the last great Jedi Master returned, he could potentially rebuild the Jedi Order. Outside the village, Kylo has shown up with his retinue, whereupon some local warlords come out to confront him. Kylo commands that these men submit to the First Order, but the warlords insist that they will never submit. With this, Kylo force chokes one of the warlords and says that all will submit. Rey asks whether Maz Kanata knew Luke Skywalker. Maz responds that there was once a time when everyone felt like they knew Luke Skywalker. He was a galactic hero. We basically just get some nice original trilogy fan feelings from all remembering how cool Luke Skywalker was, but Maz adds that she doesn't know if there are any heroes anymore. And just as Rey is about to ask what happened to them, there is a large explosion outside. Fighting has broken out between the First Order and the Warlords. Maz hands Rey a blaster, which she is reasonably competent in operating, but she doesn't just one-shot everybody, having never used a blaster before. She starts to run away, and Kylo zeroes in on her, sensing the Force. He runs after her, and the two chase through the streets until, just as Rey is on the verge of being caught, Poe shows up with the Millennium Falcon and rescues her. As Kylo watches the ship escape, he makes a call to the junkyard and instructs his pilots to fly all available ships in pursuit of the Falcon. There's a brief spacefight scene where things don't go too well for the protagonists. Rey and Poe again do a pretty good job flying, and Rey explains that she's just used the ship before sometimes to help move cargo. However, they're facing issues with the sheer number of ships that have emerged from the junkyard, piloted by First Order soldiers. Just as they're really getting overrun, some X-Wings show up led by none other than Han Solo. The First Order ships retreat, and Han docks on the ship. After 30 years, we finally see Han reunited with the Millennium Falcon. Implying a reasonable passage of time, Kylo is now on a ship being chastised by Snoke. Not only did Kylo fail to kill the Force-sensitive girl, but in attempting to capture her, he lost several fighters which were hard to procure. General Hux then says that his efforts have been more successful, having secured an alliance with several large separatist groups, and also formed an alliance with the space pirate Captain Phasma, who silently steps into view. Snoke reiterates his disappointment with Kylo and says that Luke Skywalker must be killed, lest he train a new generation of Jedi. Snoke says that he has foreseen a great awakening of Force-sensitive people unless they are able to crush the light side now. Meanwhile, we see the Millennium Falcon arrive on the planet of Biss, which is a deep-core planet and capital for the New Republic. I like the idea that to distinguish it from Coruscant, it would still be densely urbanized, but with the houses having a more suburban aesthetic rather than the insane high-rises of Coruscant. They all land and are greeted by Lord Santekka and Princess Leia. Poe introduces Rey and explains that she saved his life, and Han chimes in that she's a good pilot too. Leia and Han interact briefly to establish that they are divorced. I'm planning on keeping the idea of Kylo Ren being their son, and I like the idea that their son turning to the dark side would cause a significant rift in their marriage and result in them being separated. I don't really see the point in them being in a happy couple if their only son has joined the dark side. I get the criticism that Han and Leia being divorced is sort of a letdown, but I think this film needs some sad stuff to give it some weight. Anyway, Han says that Rey is tired and can stay at his guest accommodation, and begins walking her back. Rey again explains that she can't stay long because she still needs to get back to Jakku. Han asks if she has somebody waiting for her back there, and Rey says that she's the one waiting for them. Han looks up and says that sometimes when somebody is gone, you have to believe that they're coming back. We then of course see Kylo being told by Snoke that Rey was saved by a fleet led by Han Solo. Snoke questions why Kylo didn't sense the presence of Han, and Kylo says it's because Han means nothing to him. That's why he didn't sense him. Snoke counters that Han should mean something to Kylo since killing Han will be his final test to show his loyalty. I also think the scene should give a slightly fuller impression of the military capacities of the First Order. We see a decent number of troops at their base and a large variety of different ships that we can assume were procured from different dealers throughout the galaxy. The next morning, Rey and Han arrive at the government square and run into Poe, who says that he's on his way to the Iceno system. Poe casually name drops a few random locations to give an indication of the full extent of the conflict that's being dealt with by the New Republic. As they continue walking, they encounter another senator, we'll call him South Arden, who, having overheard some of the conversation, remarks that he's heard that Rey is from Jakku, and says that she certainly is privileged to be able to sit in on conversations pertaining to galactic security when she comes from such a rebellious and anarchic planet. At this moment, Leia appears and points out that peace is only going to come by listening to the experiences of those who feel let down by the Republic. I also like the idea that South Arden has a robotic leg that we can assume replaces one he lost in battle. Lord Santekka says that Senator Arden means well, but that his commitment to the Resistance makes him overzealous. Rey quips back that they don't know the meaning of the word resistance. They've never had to resist hunger, exploitation, or death. This shuts everybody up, and the group move on to Biss's main Jedi Temple. While there, Rey checks out a display featuring Luke's lightsaber. There's a clear sense of weight around the whole situation, with Rey seemingly being drawn to it. Suddenly, several guards at the museum begin to kill the senators. During a crossfire between Republic soldiers, including Han and Chewie, and the guards, the display for Luke's lightsaber is broken. Rey instinctively grabs it and is able to kill several of the guards, neutralizing the danger. They tried to capture one of the assassins, but he jumps out a window to his death. Han observes that Rey is actually quite skilled with a lightsaber. She downplays it, and Han is like, I mean, sure, you could use some work, but you seem like a natural. He mentions how there's a distant moon where the old Jedi archives are, and that he'd happily escort her there. Alright, let's talk about the Mary Sue stuff. I really don't have a problem with Rey being an alright pilot. In fact, it makes more sense than baby Anakin or 19-year-old farmhand Luke being good pilots. Rey has actually worked with ships before. It makes sense she'd be decent at flying them. I also don't have a problem with Rey having some minor force abilities, nor do I have a problem with Rey being a natural with a lightsaber. It's established that without training, the Force provides Force users with heightened reflexes, which would explain all of this. However, there are some more advanced Force techniques which are shown to require training, and I'll say now that those techniques are not going to be demonstrated by Rey in this rewrite. So far, Rey's abilities have pretty much followed how they're presented in the Disney film, but the Disney film really goes off the rails in the second half, and I don't want that to happen. On their way to the Jedi archives, Poe calls them to say that he's still heading to the Iceno system, but that he heard about Rey holding her own in the fight and that he's pretty impressed. He casually mentions that maybe where he's heading might lead to some clues that will help find her a teacher to get better with a lightsaber. Han and Rey reach the old Jedi Temple, which is a ruin but breathtaking in its size. Han explains that the Jedi were once powerful and stood in opposition to the Sith. However, after a young Jedi betrayed the Jedi Order, an evil empire dominated the galaxy. Even after the Empire was defeated, there were those who remained loyal and fought on, and there were those who wanted their own autonomy free from the Republic. Han says that he still believes that the galaxy can be saved and that the violence will end someday. Rey asks who the Jedi was that betrayed the Republic. We then cut to Kylo monologuing. This monologue would be very similar to what we see in the Disney film, about how he is struggling to stay strong and wants to finish what Vader started. We then see Vader's burned and melted helmet, which here functions to answer Rey's question. Meanwhile, we see that a number of First Order troopers are ransacking an old Jedi Temple. Suddenly, a group of Republic forces come in and shoot most of them, and we see that they are led by Poe Dameron. Poe interrogates one of the survivors and asks why they are ransacking the temple, and whether it pertains to the whereabouts of Luke Skywalker. Suddenly, we see a figure appear from the shadows, Kylo Ren. He tells Poe that there are greater Jedi than Luke Skywalker, holding the Darth Vader mask in his hand. He then quite effortlessly cuts through all of Poe's men. He grabs Poe with the Force and says, "You spoke to her. You know where she is." He gets the information about Rey's whereabouts with Force powers and then instructs the surviving First Order troops to kill Poe. The soldiers all start getting ready to kill Poe until suddenly one of the soldiers shoots the rest, and I hope you don't need me to tell you that it's Finn. Poe is like, "Hey, thanks for saving my life," and Finn is like, "I signed up to fight bad guys. You're not a bad guy." So rather than Finn's turn from the First Order being just to do with faulty programming, here it's motivated by a sense of owing his life to Poe after having been saved in the fire, a recognition that he and Poe share similar goals, and his discomfort with some of the more immoral actions he's seen committed by the First Order. Kylo approaches the Jedi Temple and gets a message from Snoke asking him whether he was able to retrieve the artifact from the temple. Kylo says that he did, and moreover he was able to locate Rey, to whom he is heading right now, and he adds that Han Solo is with her. Snoke tells Kylo to kill them both without hesitation. Meanwhile, in the Jedi Library, Rey is practicing fighting, while Han watches her. He observes that she'll need a teacher if she wants to get very good, which could be helped by finding out where Luke is. Rey asks Han a bit about Luke, and Han of course communicates that Luke was a great guy who fought the Empire and was awesome. Then Rey asks about what happened to Luke, and Han is like, "Well, I don't know. He was training up a new generation of Jedi, something went wrong, and nobody has seen him since." Suddenly, to interrupt any potential exposition dump, Kylo shows up with a lightsaber and stabs Han before pushing him out of the way. He easily bests Rey in an incredibly short lightsaber fight before abducting her. So this is your clear presentation of Rey's limitations, just so that she actually has some growing to do and we're going to have some contrast as she becomes a better fighter, because it would be pretty boring if she just beat Kylo in every substantial confrontation they had. So Finn and Poe arrive at Biss, and Poe explains that their attempt to stop the First Order ransacking the temple was unsuccessful, and that Kylo Ren has managed to steal Darth Vader's mask. South Arden, meanwhile, asks who Finn is and points out that literally every time Poe leaves, he seems to come back with some random person. Finn identifies himself and explains that they weren't there to pick up Vader's mask, they were there to pick up a map. Leia asks what map they were looking for, when suddenly Han Solo staggers in and collapses, saying that Kylo has taken Rey. Kylo interrogates Rey, and we have a scene that plays out pretty much identical to the Disney film. There's not been very many times so far that I've been able to say that, yep, the Disney film just got it right. But yeah, he pretty much would cover the same stuff about how he could train Rey, and also he reveals his face for the first time. Then we see Kylo's ship flying over a large army, made of First Order fighters and other separatist groups, and commanded by Hux. Hux confronts Kylo about the fact that he was told to kill Rey on sight. The two argue intensely until Kylo reveals that he believes Rey has the secret to Luke's whereabouts. Hux accuses Kylo of pulling the wool over their eyes, since he never has to defend his actions rationally but can always just appeal to the Force. Snoke instructs Hux to focus on his own command, and cautions Kylo that he has until the forthcoming battle to interrogate Rey, then he must kill her. Hux adds to kill her whether she reveals the location of Skywalker or not. Snoke then asks Kylo whether he did at least kill Han Solo. Kylo responds that he stabbed Han on sight, killing him instantly. We then, of course, cut to Han in a Republic hospital. The nurse says that the lightsaber strike was perfectly placed to miss all his vital organs. Lor Santeca points out that with this break in security and attack on a high-profile general, they need to show a display of force with a full frontal attack. Leia counters that a full frontal attack is unnecessary when they have been, all things considered, relatively effective at monitoring and countering small-scale insurgent activity. Finn interrupts and asks how exactly they monitor this insurgent activity, and Leia explains that they have several space stations throughout the galaxy that monitor large sections of space to counteract piracy, trafficking, and insurgency. Finn asks how many people know about these locations, and Leia says it's a very closely guarded secret. But Finn pushes and asks what if somebody was able to locate these secret monitoring platforms and take them out. Leia explains that they'd completely lose their ability to police that section of the galaxy and would most likely lose control over it. We then cut to the First Order flying across the galaxy to establish the danger. The First Order commanders are looking at the map and remark on how the monitoring center is built on top of the location of an old Republic fort in the area, just to establish why this old map was able to help them locate this military asset. So at this point, let's talk about why Starkiller Base is a terrible, terrible idea and needs to be replaced with something at least a little bit more interesting. So the first and most obvious issue of Starkiller Base is that it's a complete rehash of A New Hope. It's just boring, and further cements the idea that the original trilogy was pointless. At least when the Death Star returned in Episode 6, it wasn't fully complete, so you had a sense that the Empire was struggling to recover from the defeat in Episode 4. However, here, far from being unfinished, Starkiller Base is way more powerful than the original Death Star. It's capable of blowing up several planets at once just like that. The issue is that this type of elevation is one of the worst things a sequel can do. Just making everything bigger and bigger is hacky and short-sighted. If you want to keep this expanded universe going, then this gimmick just becomes increasingly farcical. It also makes the galaxy seem kind of unimportant when 7 planets are just destroyed like they're completely disposable. It conditions us not to care about each individual planet when we see 7 get blown up like it's nothing in one pop. A fourth issue is that this level of power for the First Order seems to fly in the face of the Empire's defeat at the end of the original film. Also, this giant vulnerable space station leaves the First Order incredibly exposed to an attack, since all their resources are tied up in this one space station, which is just poor strategy. And this is especially bad narratively because the 6th and final issue I want to point out with Starkiller Base is that when you introduce a weapon this destructive in the hands of the bad guys, it basically necessitates that this film will end in a First Order defeat, which flies directly in the face of what should be the main goal of this film, to explain and justify why the First Order is able to present a threat to the Republic. What we have in the Disney plot is the First Order, which is the remnants of a defeated power, going up against the established government. The First Order then invests more resources into the fight than the Republic by building this space station, and loses more resources when it's destroyed, but somehow the First Order end up coming out of this whole thing victorious. This makes it virtually impossible to tell which side should actually be winning in these conflicts. At the end of the Disney film, everything I would have assumed about the limitations of the First Order's power has been completely contradicted, so I'm left wondering exactly how defeated the First Order are. Throughout the entire sequel trilogy, I really had no sense of who was winning the war, and any time I did get any indication of who was winning, it totally contradicted what I'd have assumed based on what the film had shown so far. When I first saw the First Order, I assumed they must be a relatively weak insurgency force, but that was clearly not true. When the Starkiller Base was completely destroyed, I thought that the First Order must have invested a huge amount in it and been quite soundly defeated, but apparently that wasn't true either. This is why I propose the Surveillance Station as an alternative to Starkiller Base. This is something that the First Order can launch an assault on, which works because we need this film to end with a defeat for the New Republic, to show that the First Order are a threat. Of course, the First Order can't attack a giant space weapon, because the Republic shouldn't be operating giant space weapons. So after thinking for a while, I realized that a giant radar machine would be the best solution. By crippling this, the Republic would be blinded and a portion of the galaxy would be overrun with disorder, forcing the Republic to retreat from that area. So back to the film. The Republic generals are all sat around in the war room discussing which precise surveillance station the First Order would be likely to attack. Leia points out that the space stations have large cannons, making them hard to attack, so a large army would be needed to destroy one. Thus, they might be able to catch the First Order and destroy them. Poe reasons this might be their logic too, and suggests that they would attack the surveillance station at Fornax, since a large number of Republic forces are stationed there, and it would be embarrassing for the Republic to retreat from an area they've invested so much in militarily. They don't go off this hunch alone and get some intel that a large army appears to be heading in that direction. Leia contacts the Iridonians, who are on a planet nearby, to send reinforcements to the base. Meanwhile, Republic troops start gearing up for the upcoming war, and Leia reflects on how this will be the first major battle in decades, and nothing can prepare the soldiers for what lies ahead. We cut to some Iridonians flying down towards Fornax. The ship shakes, which they dismiss as turbulence. However, as they are let in by the guards and begin to disembark, a lightsaber ignites behind them, and Kylo Ren begins slaughtering them all, slicing into somebody as the scene transitions to. On the ship heading from Biss, we see Han and Leia having a conversation similar to the one they have in the Disney film. I quite like this conversation, however I would switch them round, so maybe that's not a glowing endorsement when I'm saying I prefer the exact opposite of what we got in the actual film. In the Disney version, Leia is confident Kylo can be saved, while Han is less so. This makes it way less impactful when Han dies. He expected Kylo was evil and beyond saving, and then he gets exactly what he's expecting. Therefore, in my version, Han would be very confident he can bring Kylo back to the light side, citing the way Kylo stabbed him to avoid killing him. Leia is just a bit more negative, and clearly it hurts her too much to hope. I'd also maybe have the two reflect in a bittersweet way on their relationship, with an emphasis on how happy they were until everything went bad. I also like the idea that they can't love each other anymore because they remind each other of Kylo. That's a neat idea. Anyway, we now get into the final battle of the film. The first wave of Republic troops land on Fornax, only to discover that rather than the full frontal assault they expected, the attack appears to be a small stealth mission based on the first few dead guards lying around. They then realize that the full frontal assault is instead occurring on Iridonia. This is when I introduce a new concept I just made up. There is a minimum distance you have to travel in order to hyperdrive, and larger vessels have a larger minimum distance because of momentum and inertia and all that physics stuff. Therefore, they can't send the large troop transports to Iridonia from Fornax, so the bulk of their army is unable to help out. Instead, they send a team of fighters led by Poe Dameron. I wanted to include this idea of a minimum distance you have to hyperdrive, mostly because movement of troops is a really significant part of battle tactics that kind of feels missing from Star Wars when you can hyperdrive so quickly. I personally prefer battle plans to seem somewhat intelligent, so introducing this element to space travel should allow for interesting battle strategies like this. We then cut to the fight between the Iridonians and the First Order, just to get an idea of the destruction occurring, obviously not lingering on it too long since we don't really care about any of these specific people there. Next, the Republic troops, including Han, Finn, and Chewie, enter deep into the planet caverns. However, they are confronted by elite troops and we get a fun shootout. This is also our main opportunity to see Captain Phasma being incredibly effective. She's not going to get shoved into a rubbish disposal thing in this film. While this intensive shootout is going on, we see Kylo planting various explosive charges throughout the facility. Meanwhile, we cut to Rey held captive on a ship. General Hux walks in and tells her she will be allowed to live if she reveals the location of Luke Skywalker. Rey says that she doesn't know, and Hux says that wouldn't surprise him, since he suspects that Kylo was looking for an excuse to keep her alive. He picks up a gun and points it at her, saying that neither of them will be around for much longer. However, Leia, in the midst of the battle, senses Rey's presence and instructs her crew to fire on the ship she's in to destroy the power generators. Just as Hux is about to shoot Rey, the power cuts and in the dark confusion, Rey is able to run away as the mechanism keeping her captured shuts off. The ship begins to crash land, and Leia instructs the cannons not to destroy the ship as Rey is on it. We briefly cut to Iridonia, where the planet is being destroyed. Again, the main focus here should be the scale of the conflict, rather than any specific individuals. This changes though when Poe Dameron shows up and engages in some dogfights and is shown to provide some considerable assistance. Back on Fornax, we see First Order troops spill out of the wreckage as the battle on the ground intensifies. Thousands of soldiers from both sides fall dead as lasers fly everywhere. With the Winter Forest landscape, it would look like the Battle of the Bulge. Rey sneaks out of the ship and heads beneath the surface for cover. Kylo finishes placing the charges as Han pursues him. This leads to Han confronting Kylo, while Rey, Finn, and Chewie watch. Just as in the Disney film, Han attempts to reason with Kylo, but this time Kylo kills him definitively. Leia, much closer to the action than she was in the Disney film, is almost incapacitated by the shock. From here, things, as they occasionally have in this rewrite, play out very similar to in the Disney version. Our surviving main characters all end up fighting on the surface. I don't have a problem with Kylo not being at his best here, since we've seen him at his best at several other points in this film. I would still have it so he's been shot, which would make it much harder for him to fight. Also, it could be implied that he's so emotionally distressed at this point that he sort of wants to die. I wouldn't have Rey move the lightsaber with her mind because that seems to be an ability Jedi develop after a decent while. The most substantial difference with this fight is that it would take place in the middle of a massive battle. There are huge numbers of militants spilling out onto the planet, giant cannons exploding whole platoons, fighters dive-bombing people. Now in my version, Kylo does ultimately best Rey, but then he is knocked out by a stray blast. I was considering giving Mark Hamill what he wanted and having Luke show up here.
The lightsaber goes like this and flies off. I said, oh, what a great entrance. Ah! Rey caught it?
However, I really think that saving Luke until the next installment is a good idea, so instead Kylo is defeated somewhat by luck and the Millennium Falcon shows up to rescue Rey and Finn. Now, I do need to point out something that I only realized incredibly late into finalizing this plot outline. This is the first time Rey and Finn meet each other. Basically, Poe and Finn swap places in relation to Rey. You might say this is a weakness of the plot, and I definitely agree it isn't ideal. Unfortunately, I needed to push Finn's change of allegiance towards the middle of the film in order to make it seem a bit more earned, but I also needed Rey to get abducted when few other people would be around to help her. The consequence of these two priorities is that Rey and Finn only interact for the first time here. However, there are two key strengths this rewrite has over the Disney version. Firstly, at least they interact at all before the end of the film, unlike Poe and Rey, who famously don't talk until the end of the second film. Secondly, Finn gets seriously injured defending Rey here. If their relationship has to only begin at the end of this film, it at least begins with a substantial basis for their relationship to be strong going forward. Finn saving Rey here also works great for his character. It quite climactically completes his turn to the good side. He starts off as part of the First Order, and now ends the film defending one of the last known Jedi against his former boss. By attaching his defense of Rey to his wider character arc, I'm hoping it will make their relationship feel a bit more substantial. Thus, all three main characters can begin the second film with a strong basis for being friends. They've all saved each other at various points. Anyway, back to the fight, where the First Order begins to retreat as the tide is turning against them, and Kylo is taken into a ship and flown away. Captain Phasma emerges from a cavern and effortlessly blasts away several Republic soldiers before getting onto a fighter. Poe returns, and there is an attempt to chase down the First Order, but as some fighters hold them off, much of the First Order is able to escape. First Order soldiers on the planet are instructed to fight until the last man, and they begin to get gunned down as the Republic closes in. However, Rey cautions Leia that their surveillance abilities have been destroyed, so their only hope now is to inspire people to believe the Republic is morally superior. Therefore, government troops hold back a bit and instruct the militants to stand down, which they eventually do despite the protestations of their commanders. We begin to see the Republic troops move in and arrest the opposing forces. After this, we get these standard epilogue scenes, which I'll just go through really quickly. There's a celebration on Iridonia, but ultimately the main characters come to the realization that this has been a serious loss for them, and they're likely to see the power of the Republic erode in this area. Meanwhile, Leia is obviously beyond consolation regarding Han's death. Kylo is confronted by Hux about the perceived failures of the mission since so many men were lost. Phasma, however, defends the attack as having seriously undermined the Republic. Snoke says that the real concern is the survival of Rey. He says that Luke Skywalker must be killed, and then he goes on a bit of a monologue about the danger of the Force awakening. Meanwhile, over top of this monologue, we see a hooded figure with a robot hand knelt over Han's body, grieving. Then he gets up and leaves. And that's how it ends. One thing I've rejected is the decision of The Force Awakens to end where the next film kicks off. I personally don't like that. One of the staples of Star Wars is that each time when we come back for another story, there's always more things that have happened in the interim. There's new information to pick up. In The Force Awakens, we just go straight into the next film, and I can't get behind that. So in this one, we just end with this revelation that Luke is out there, and that's our setup for the next film, The Last Jedi, which I will of course give my own rewrite of in a short while. So I'll just conclude with a summary of the main strengths this rewrite brings that I think are missing from the Disney film. 1. The New Republic is actually portrayed as a New Republic, rather than just a Rebellion 2.0, so it makes the Rebellion in the original trilogy feel like it had a point. 2. The First Order is portrayed as something other than the Empire 2.0, again, not a rehash of A New Hope, and makes a lot more sense as a follow-up to the defeat of the Empire in Return of the Jedi. Moreover, the First Order are a bit more of an interesting and dynamic threat, since they start off as underdogs. 3. On that note, Finn makes a lot more sense in this version. He actually goes through a decent character change, rather than simply being a good guy because of a glitch. In my version, he chose to abandon something significant when he leaves the First Order. Friends, and also the promise of exacting brutal revenge on those who wronged him and his family. These are elements that will affect his character down the line, rather than in Disney's sequel trilogy, where him being a stormtrooper isn't that significant at all. 4. I haven't changed Poe Dameron much. I've changed some of what happens to him, but in terms of character, he's basically the same. 5. Rey is similar as well, obviously a similar motivation relating to her parents, however I've made her less skilled, so there's plenty of room for her to grow to build up her power like Luke and Anakin did. 6. I tried to make Han a bit more like a mentor to Rey, like Ben Kenobi. This way his death is hopefully much more impactful. 7. I think I did the best I could with Luke. I'd have liked to make it so that Luke, Han and Leia could have had that final reunion, but I also like the idea of saving Luke until the second film. Therefore having him show up at the end to mourn Han was a good compromise in my view. 8. This reason is also why I positioned Leia closer to the actual fight. So again, Han's death isn't something that happens light years away where his closest friend doesn't even find out about it until into the second film. 9. Kylo remains pretty much the same, which makes sense since he was the best character from Disney's version. 10. Hux obviously is still only a minor character, but I like that he's more deceptive and evil in this, such as when he told Rey that she'd live if she revealed the location of Luke, even though he'd previously told Kylo that he was going to kill her no matter what. I also hope it's clear that he just literally hates the Force, which sets up a future conflict between him and Kylo. 11. This conflict between Kylo and Hux helps to explain why Snoke works so well as an antagonist. He's not implied to be super powerful, but he's clearly good at bringing multiple competing parties together to work for him. 12. Now Phasma is the change I'm most happy with. Even though she hardly appears at all, she's definitely set up as a really threatening character here. Obviously she doesn't say or do much at first, but just looks cool. And then in the final action scene, obviously I can't show you the final action scene, but it would demonstrate just how effective she is. I can imagine by the end of this film, people would really want to see more of this character in action. And 13, and finally, I'm so happy that I avoided this film ending with a fight over a gigantic space laser. I'll just say some final things on the plot. There is a recurring theme in this film that the Force is awakening. We're told that the number of Force-sensitive people has declined, but that they are growing in number. The location of Luke is very underdeveloped, but that is intentional. I already know what's going to happen in The Last Jedi. I've planned it all out. Most of all, I hope that this rewrite did a good job at showing how a relatively small threat at the beginning, the First Order, can go on to seriously challenge the New Republic. What I want is for the First Order to be a genuine threat in the second film without it being ridiculous or just being reduced down to a giant space bazooka. So I would really like to get The Last Jedi rewrite out within just a few weeks, but to justify that it would be good if I had a decent number of subscribers and this video gained some traction. So please do share this video. If you like this video, then sharing it around is a totally free way of guaranteeing I will be motivated to make more of this content. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again for the next video.